The old mapmaker's candlelit study. In a quiet town at the very edge of the world, where cobblestone streets wound gently between timber-framed houses, and the air always carried the faint scent of wood smoke in evening rain, there lived an old mapmaker. His name had been spoken so rarely over the years that even he sometimes forgot it, though this never troubled him. Names were less important than the work itself. The slow, careful work of drawing lines across parchment, of giving shape to coastlines that existed only in memory and imagination. His home stood at the corner of two narrow lanes, a small building with warped wooden beams and windows that glowed amber each evening as the sun descended. The lower floor served as his workshop, though no customers came anymore. The maps he made now were not for sale, not for navigation, not for any purpose the world might recognize. They were made for comfort, for quiet, for the gentle pleasure of watching ink flow across paper in the candlelight. Evening had come again, as it always did, with that particular softness that autumn brings. The sky had shifted through shades of pearl and lavender before settling into a deep, still blue. Street lamps had been lit by the lamplighter, an old woman who walked her rounds with a long brass pole, touching flame to wick with practiced ease. The mapmaker had watched her from his window, as he often did, grateful for her steady presence in the rhythm of each day's end. Now the street outside had grown quiet. The last footsteps had faded. A cart had rolled past perhaps 20 minutes ago, its wheels making that particular hollow sound against stone that speaks of emptiness and the day's work done. A dog had barked once, twice, then fallen silent. Somewhere in the distance, a door had closed with a soft, final sound. The mapmaker stood in the small entryway of his home, his hand resting on the newel post at the base of the stairs. He was not yet ready to climb to his bedroom on the upper floor. Sleep would come later, in its own time. First, there was the evening's work, the ritual that had sustained him through countless nights, through seasons and years, through the gradual emptying of his life until only this remained: the study, the candles, the maps. He moved slowly through the darkened hallway, his slippers making almost no sound against the wooden floor. The boards were smooth and worn, shaped by decades of footsteps, his own, and before that, others whose faces he could barely recall. The house held memory in its beams and floorboards, in the way certain steps creaked and certain doors hung just slightly crooked in their frames. At the end of the hall, a door stood open. Beyond it lay the study. He paused there for a moment, as he always did, letting his eyes adjust to the deeper darkness within. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax, of ink and dust, and the particular dry scent of parchment stored in wooden drawers. It was a small room, hardly more than 10 feet square, with a single window that looked out onto the lane and the rooftops beyond. A heavy desk occupied most of the space, its surface clean and waiting. Shelves lined 2 walls, filled with rolled maps, leather-bound journals, boxes of pens and pencils, jars of pigment, bottles of ink. The mapmaker stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a gentle click. For a moment, he simply stood in the darkness, letting the quiet settle around him like a familiar cloak. There was no need to rush. The evening stretched before him, empty and patient. Outside, the world continued in its small ways, a leaf falling, a cat moving along a garden wall, the wind shifting in the eaves. But here, in this room, time moved differently. Slower, softer. He crossed to the desk and reached for the candlestick that stood at its corner. It was brass, tarnished to a dull gold, with a broad base and a tall stem. The candle itself was thick and cream-colored, its wick slightly blackened from previous lightings. Beside it lay a small box of matches, made of pale wood with red tips. The mapmaker picked up the matchbox and slid it open. The sound was small and precise, a whisper of wood against wood. Inside, the matches lay in neat rows, their tips like tiny rubies in the darkness. He selected one and drew it out, feeling its light weight between his fingers. He struck the match against the side of the box. The sound was sudden but not harsh, a soft scrape, followed by the immediate hiss and bloom of flame. Light spilled across his hands, warm and golden, casting his fingers into sharp relief. The match burned steadily, its flame small and bright, releasing the faint scent of sulfur and burning wood. The mapmaker touched the flame to the candle's wick and waited. For a moment nothing happened. Then the wick caught, and a second flame was born, larger, steadier, settling into its shape as the wax around it began to soften and pool. He shook out the match and set it aside in a small ceramic dish kept for that purpose. Then he lifted the candlestick and carried it to the other side of the desk, where a second candle waited in a matching brass holder. He lit this one from the first, touching wick to flame until the light doubled. The room began to emerge from darkness. Shadows retreated into corners. The desk surface became visible, smoothwood worn pale in the center where countless maps had been drawn. The shelves revealed themselves in layers, each holding its particular collection of tools and materials. The window became a square of deeper darkness, reflecting the candle flames as two small points of gold. The mapmaker returned to the desk and lit a third candle, this one shorter and squatter, in a pewter holder near the corner where he kept his inkwells. Then a fourth, in a delicate glass holder that cast prismatic shadows across the wall. He moved without hurry, taking pleasure in each small flame, in the way the light grew and spread and settled into the room's familiar corners. When all 4 candles were burning, he stepped back and surveyed his study. The light was warm and golden, gentle enough not to strain the eyes, bright enough to work by. It flickered slightly when he moved, causing shadows to shift and dance across the shelves, the ceiling, the spines of old journals. The flames themselves were mesmerizing, each one unique in its small movements, burning with a quiet steadiness that asked nothing, offered everything. The mapmaker pulled out his chair, a simple wooden chair with a worn seat cushion tied to it with faded ribbon, and sat down slowly, feeling his body settle into its accustomed place. He rested his hands on the desk surface, palms down, and allowed himself a long, slow breath. This was the moment he loved most. The threshold between the day's end and the evening's work. The moment when the world outside faded away and the study became its own small universe, contained and complete. He sat for a time without moving, simply watching the candle flames, listening to the quiet. There was so much to hear in silence, he had learned. The faint tick of the old clock on the shelf behind him. The almost imperceptible creak of the house settling. His own breathing, steady and slow. The distant murmur of wind against the window glass. Outside, the night deepened. A church bell tolled the hour somewhere in the town's center, 8 soft chimes that reached him like echoes from another world. The mapmaker listened to the last chime fade into the night air, then turned his attention to the desk before him. The surface was clear except for the candles and a small brass tray that held his most frequently used tools. A few pencils, a ruler, a compass with delicate brass arms. Everything else resided in its proper place, waiting to be called upon. He opened the desk's top drawer, a wide shallow drawer that slid out with barely a whisper of wood against wood. Inside lay sheets of parchment, each one carefully cut and stored flat, separated by thin pieces of cotton cloth to protect them from rubbing against one another. The parchment was a pale cream color, slightly textured, made by a papermaker in a village 2 days' journey away. The mapmaker ordered it twice a year, always the same size, always the same quality. Consistency was a comfort in itself. He lifted the top sheet carefully, feeling its weight and texture between his fingers. Good parchment had a certain feel to it. Not too stiff, not too soft, with just enough tooth to catch the pencil and ink without absorbing too much. This sheet was perfect, as they always were. He laid it on the desk, centering it in the space before him, smoothing it gently with both hands. The parchment seemed to glow in the candlelight, pale gold and waiting. For a moment, he simply looked at it, this empty page. There was something deeply peaceful about blankness, about potential. The sheet held within it 1,000 possible maps, 1,000 coastlines and mountain ranges and winding roads. In its emptiness, it was already complete. But tonight he would fill it, slowly and carefully, with one particular vision. The mapmaker reached for a pencil from the brass tray. This one was his favorite, its wood smooth and dark, its graphite soft enough to make gentle lines without pressing hard into the paper. He had sharpened it yesterday, and the point was still good, tapering to a fine tip that would allow for delicate work. Still, he reached for his knife and the small wooden box he kept for shavings. It was part of the ritual, this sharpening, even when the pencil needed none. The act itself was meditative, the careful paring away of wood, the gradual revelation of graphite, the soft curl of shavings falling into the box. He held the pencil in his left hand and the knife in his right, setting the blade against the wood at a shallow angle. The first stroke removed a thin ribbon of wood, exposing the dark graphite beneath. The second stroke smoothed it further. He turned the pencil slowly in his fingers, working around its circumference, each cut deliberate and controlled. The shavings fell into the box with the faintest whisper of sound. They were beautiful in their way, delicate spirals of dark wood, each one catching the candlelight along its curved edge. The mapmaker watched them accumulate, taking pleasure in their small, perfect forms. When the pencil was sharpened to his satisfaction, he set down the knife and tested the point against his thumb, not pressing, just feeling its sharpness. Good. He brushed the few remaining shavings from the desk onto the floor, where they would be swept up later, or tomorrow, or perhaps the day after. There was no hurry. He closed the shaving box and returned it to its place in the drawer, then positioned the pencil above the parchment, his hand hovering for a moment in the candlelight. What map would he draw tonight? This question always came, and the answer was never planned. He did not sketch preliminary ideas or make notes. He simply began, letting his hand move where it wished, allowing the map to emerge from some deep place within him that knew things his conscious mind had forgotten or perhaps never known. Tonight, he felt drawn to water, to coastlines, to the gentle meeting of land and sea. He touched pencil to paper and drew the first line. It curved gently from left to right, a flowing line that suggested a shore viewed from a great height. Not a straight coast, not a harsh one, but something soft and welcoming, a place where the water would lap gently against sand, where tide pools would form among smooth rocks, where one could walk for hours and hear nothing but the quiet conversation of waves. The mapmaker drew slowly, letting the line breathe and meander. He was in no hurry. Each curve received his full attention, each slight adjustment of angle or pressure. The pencil made a soft scratching sound against the parchment, a sound that was somehow both present and distant, like rain on a faraway roof. He drew another line parallel to the first, slightly inland, suggesting a low ridge or perhaps the edge of coastal grassland. Between these two lines, the shore existed, that liminal space where earth and water met and parted and met again with every tide. The candlelight flickered slightly, and shadows moved across the parchment. The lines he had drawn seemed to shift and breathe with the light, becoming momentarily darker, then lighter, as if the map itself were alive. The mapmaker continued working, adding small details, an inlet here, a point of land there. He drew a small promontory that extended into the water like a beckoning finger, and at its tip he suggested rocks, just a few small marks that implied their presence without defining them too precisely. Mystery was important in maps. The imagination needed space to wander. After some time, he couldn't have said how long, he set down the pencil and flexed his fingers, working out the slight stiffness that came from holding the same position. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked softly, and regarded what he had drawn. A coastline was beginning to emerge. Not a real place, though it reminded him of shores he had known in his youth. A particular stretch of the northern coast where he had once spent a summer, mapping the coves and inlets for a merchant company. That had been real work, practical work, done in bright daylight with instruments and measurements and the constant awareness of accuracy required. This was different. This was cartography of the soul, if such a thing could be said to exist. He had no need to be accurate now. The coast he was drawing existed only here, on this parchment, in this candlelit study. It was a shore for the mind to walk along when the real world grew too sharp, too demanding. A place to rest. The mapmaker reached for another drawer, this one on the right side of the desk. It held his inks, bottles of various sizes, some nearly full, others reduced to mere traces at the bottom. He selected a small bottle of sepia ink, a warm brown that would be perfect for the lines he wanted to trace in pen once the pencil work was complete. But not yet. First, more pencil work, more shaping and defining. He picked up the pencil again and added a cluster of small islands just off the coast, 5 or 6 of them, arranged in a loose archipelago. On maps, islands were called many things depending on their size and nature. These were small enough to be called islets, perhaps, or skerries if one were using the old northern terms. He drew them with just a few quick strokes each, suggesting their presence without overworking them. Between the islands and the mainland, he indicated shallow water with tiny parallel lines, a cartographic convention that suggested sandbars or reefs just beneath the surface. This would be a place to wade at low tide, or to navigate carefully in a small boat, watching for the subtle changes in watercolor that warned of hidden obstacles. The mapmaker set down his pencil and reached for a cloth, a soft piece of chamois leather that he kept folded beside his inkwells. He used it now to gently brush away the few eraser crumbs and graphite dust that had accumulated on the parchment, working from the center outward with light, careful strokes. The cloth whispered across the paper's surface, and when he was done, the map lay clean and ready for the next stage of work. He studied the coastline he had created, letting his eyes travel along its curves and indentations, following the shore from the lower left corner of the parchment up toward the right, where it disappeared off the edge of the page. In his mind, it continued beyond what was drawn, the coast extending indefinitely, running on through landscapes he would never map, toward horizons that existed only in imagination. This was another pleasure of the work, the knowledge that every map was incomplete, that beyond its borders lay more shore, more water, more land. The world was too vast to ever be fully captured, even a world that existed only in thought. He turned the parchment slightly, adjusting its angle so the candlelight fell across it more evenly. The flames cast their warm glow across the page, and the pencil lines seemed to deepen and soften simultaneously, becoming more real and more dreamlike at once. Now for the ink. The Mapmaker unscrewed the cap of the sepia ink bottle, a small vessel of dark glass with a brass cap that had long since tarnished to a mottled green and brown. The cap made a slight clicking sound as it came free, and immediately the faint scent of ink rose into the air, earthy and slightly metallic, a smell that always brought him a sense of calm and rightness. He set the cap aside and reached for his pen holder, a simple wooden handle into which various nibs could be fitted. Tonight he selected a fine-pointed nib, one that would produce delicate lines suitable for coastlines and details. He fitted the nib into the holder, tightening the small brass collar that held it in place, then dipped it carefully into the ink. The nib broke the surface of the liquid with barely a sound. He held it submerged for a moment, letting the ink flow up into the small reservoir behind the point, then withdrew it slowly and touched the excess against the inside rim of the bottle. A bead of ink clung to the nib's tip, dark and glossy in the candlelight. The Mapmaker positioned his hand above the parchment, steadying his wrist against the desk's edge. This was the moment of commitment. Pencil lines could be erased, redrawn, adjusted. Ink was permanent. Once laid down, it became part of the map forever. He found this comforting rather than frightening. There was freedom in permanence, in the acceptance that what was done was done. He touched the nib to paper and began to trace over the pencil lines. The ink flowed smoothly, leaving a trail of warm brown that was both darker and richer than the graphite beneath. The pen made a different sound than the pencil, a softer scratch, more liquid, with occasional tiny skips and catches that spoke of the nib's movement across the paper's texture. These imperfections were not flaws but evidence of the hand at work, proof that a human being had sat here in candlelight and drawn each line with care. The Mapmaker worked slowly along the coast, following the curves he had laid down in pencil. His hand was steady despite his age, guided by decades of practice and by the deep calm that always descended when he worked like this. The outside world fell away completely. There was only the nib, the ink, the parchment, the line emerging beneath his hand. He came to the small promontory and traced its outline, the pen following the land as it extended out into the water. At its tip, where he had suggested rocks, he added small circular marks, islands in miniature, each one complete in itself, each one a world no larger than a drop of ink. The work was meditative, almost hypnotic. Each line required attention, but not strain. He was present but not tense, focused but not forcing. This was the state he sought each evening, this place of quiet absorption where time ceased to have meaning and the self dissolved into the simple act of making. A candle guttered slightly, its flame dipping and recovering. The Mapmaker paused to glance at it, the one in the glass holder, nearest the window. It had burned down more than the others, perhaps because of a draft he couldn't feel. The flame danced for a moment longer, then steadied. He would need to replace it soon, but not yet. There was still light enough, still time. He returned to the map and continued inking the coastline, moving now toward the cluster of small islands. These required a lighter touch, a more delicate line, to suggest their smaller scale. He dipped the nib again, taking up fresh ink, and carefully outlined the first island, an irregular oval shape, barely larger than his thumbnail on the parchment. As he worked, his mind wandered in the way it often did during these evening hours. Not thinking exactly, but allowing memories and images to drift through like clouds across an internal sky. He found himself remembering mornings by the sea, the particular quality of light that comes just after dawn when the sun is still low and everything is touched with gold and silver. The sound of waves breaking, that eternal rhythm that speaks of something larger than human time. The cry of gulls, harsh and lonely and somehow perfect. He had not been to the coast in years now. His traveling days were long past. But he could still walk those shores in memory, and more than that, he could create new shores here in his study, new coastlines that held all the peace and beauty of the real places he had known, distilled and purified, freed from the discomforts and difficulties that always accompanied actual travel. These maps were better than memory. They were memory transformed into something both more and less than reality. More because they held only the essential qualities, the emotional truth of a place, and less because they existed only on paper, only in candlelight, only in this small room at the edge of the world. The mapmaker completed the islands and moved on to the shallow water between them and the mainland. The tiny parallel lines required patience. Each one needed to be drawn carefully, maintaining consistent spacing and angle. This was the kind of detail work that some mapmakers found tedious, but he had always loved it. There was something satisfying about the repetition, the gradual filling in of space with ordered marks. The pen scratched softly, rhythmically, laying down line after line. The ink dried quickly in the dry air of the study, taking on a slightly lighter tone as it set, becoming more brown than black, more earth than shadow. When the shallow water was indicated to his satisfaction, he set down the pen and flexed his hand again, working his fingers open and closed several times. A slight ache had begun to settle into his knuckles. Nothing serious, just the reminder that his body was old and had limits. He didn't mind. These small discomforts were part of the evening ritual, familiar as the candle flames themselves. He leaned back in his chair and studied the map with half-closed eyes, softening his focus so that the details blurred and only the larger shapes remained. This was a technique he had learned long ago for checking the overall composition of a map, whether the elements were properly balanced, whether the eye moved comfortably across the page, whether anything felt out of place. The coast looked good. It had rhythm and flow. The islands provided a point of interest without overwhelming the simpler beauty of the main shoreline. The bay gave depth and suggested human presence without requiring him to actually draw buildings or harbors. But something was missing. He studied the map more carefully, trying to identify what his intuition was telling him. Ah, yes. The land beyond the coast needed more definition. As it stood now, the interior was mostly blank, just that single ridge line suggesting hills in the distance. The map needed something more, some hint of what lay beyond the shore, some suggestion of depth and space. The mapmaker dipped his pen again and began to add contour lines to suggest the rising land. He drew them lightly, not making them as prominent as the coastline itself, but giving them enough presence to indicate terrain. The lines curved gently across the upper portion of the parchment, each one representing a rise in elevation, the spaces between them suggesting the slope of the land. As he drew, he imagined walking this terrain, climbing up from the shore, feeling the ground rise beneath his feet, perhaps following a path worn by sheep or shepherds. The grass would be coarse and salt-tinged near the water, becoming softer and greener as one moved inland. There might be stone walls, low and ancient, dividing the land into parcels that had been farmed for generations, though now perhaps given over to grazing. He added a few small marks to suggest scattered trees or shrubs. Nothing too specific, just small shapes that broke up the emptiness of the hills and gave them character. A copse here, a lone tree there. Places where birds might nest, where travelers might rest in the shade. The clock chimed once, marking the half-hour. 8:30 now. The evening deepening steadily toward night proper. The mapmaker paused in his work and became aware, suddenly, of the quiet. It seemed to have grown thicker, somehow more present. Outside, even the wind had stilled. The town lay wrapped in that particular silence that comes when everyone has retreated indoors, when the day's business is done and the night's rest has not quite begun. He set down the pen and reached for the teacup that sat at the corner of his desk, then remembered it was empty. He had drunk the last of it, when? An hour ago? 2. Time moved strangely in this room, stretching and compressing in ways that made measurement impossible. Perhaps it was time for more tea. The ritual of tea-making would be a pleasant interlude, a way to rest his hand and his eyes before continuing with the map. The mapmaker pushed back his chair and rose slowly from the desk, feeling the stiffness in his back and legs that came from sitting in one position for an extended time. He straightened carefully, placing one hand on the desk's edge for balance, and allowed himself a moment to simply stand and breathe. The study seemed smaller when he was standing, more intimate. The shelves rose around him on 3 sides, their contents visible in the candlelight, rolled maps bound with ribbon, boxes of drawing instruments, jars of pigments in ochre and burnt sienna and Prussian blue. On one shelf stood a collection of small objects he had gathered over the years. A piece of driftwood shaped by water into an abstract curve, a smooth stone with a stripe of quartz running through it, a brass compass rose salvaged from an old map that had otherwise crumbled to dust. These things were companions of a sort, witnesses to his quiet work. He picked up the empty teacup and carried it toward the door, moving carefully in the candlelight. The study had no hearth of its own. The house's only fireplace was in the front room, used sparingly now that he lived alone. But he had a spirit lamp for heating water, kept on a small table in the hallway just outside the study door. He opened the door and stepped into the darkness of the hall, where the candlelight from the study spilled out in a soft rectangle across the floor. The spirit lamp sat waiting on its table, along with a small brass kettle and a tin of tea leaves. Everything in its place, everything within reach. The Mapmaker set down his cup and reached for the lamp. It was a simple device, a small brass reservoir filled with alcohol, a wick, and a wire frame to support the kettle above the flame. He had used it countless times over the years, and the process of lighting it was as natural to him as breathing. He struck a match and touched it to the lamp's wick. The flame caught immediately, burning with a clean blue-tinged light that was different from the warm yellow of the candles. It was a functional flame, a working flame, meant for heating rather than illumination. He adjusted the wick slightly, reducing the flame to a steady, modest height, then positioned the kettle above it on the wire frame. The kettle was already half full of water from earlier in the evening. He could hear it begin to tick and whisper as the heat rose into the metal, the first stirrings of the water inside responding to the warmth. While he waited for the water to heat, the Mapmaker stood in the hallway and looked back into his study. From this angle, lit only by the 4 candles, it looked like something from a painting, a scene of quiet industry, a meditation on solitude and craft. The desk with its parchment, the shelves with their burden of maps and books, the window reflecting the candlelight back into the room. It occurred to him, not for the first time, that this might be the truest map he had ever made, not any particular drawing on parchment, but the room itself, this space he had shaped over decades into an exact representation of his inner landscape. Every object placed with care, every tool selected for its rightness, every surface worn smooth by use and familiarity. The kettle began to hum, that low, gathering sound that precedes boiling. The Mapmaker opened the tea tin and spooned leaves into a small ceramic pot he kept for this purpose. The tea was a simple black variety, nothing fancy, purchased from a shop in the town square. Its scent rose as he disturbed the leaves, earthy and slightly sweet, with a hint of smoke. He waited, listening to the kettle's voice deepen and grow stronger. There was no hurry. The map would wait. Everything would wait. That was the gift of these evening hours. They belonged entirely to him, structured only by the rhythms he chose, interrupted by nothing. The kettle began to sputter and steam. The Mapmaker lifted it from the lamp and poured the hot water over the tea leaves in the pot. The water darkened immediately, releasing wisps of fragrant steam. He set the kettle back on the table and placed the lid on the teapot, then stood watching as the tea steeped, the color deepening from amber to a rich reddish-brown. While he waited, he became aware of sounds from elsewhere in the house, small creaks and settling noises that older buildings make as they cool in the evening air. The house was breathing, in its way, expanding and contracting with temperature changes, its timbers shifting infinitesimally in their joints. These sounds were companionable rather than unsettling. They spoke of shelter, of walls that had stood for generations and would stand for generations more. After a few minutes, the Mapmaker poured tea into his cup, filling it nearly to the brim. The liquid was dark and hot, and steam rose from its surface in slow, curling patterns. He lifted the cup carefully, feeling the warmth transfer through the ceramic to his hands, a pleasant sensation on a cool evening. He carried the cup back into the study, moving slowly to avoid spilling, and set it on a small cork mat at the corner of his desk where it would be within easy reach, but safely distant from the parchment. Tea and maps were a dangerous combination if one was careless. He had learned that lesson decades ago when an accidental spill had ruined 3 days' work on a commission map. Since then, he had been scrupulous about keeping liquids at a safe distance. The Mapmaker settled back into his chair, the cushion compressing beneath him with familiar softness. He looked at the map before him, seeing it again with fresh eyes after the brief interlude of tea-making. The coastline pleased him. It had the quality he sought, that sense of gentleness and invitation, of a place that would welcome a visitor without demanding anything in return. But it was not yet complete. There were elements still missing, details that would give the map depth and character. He picked up his pencil again. He would work in pencil for a while before returning to ink, and considered what to add next. His eye was drawn to the interior, to the hills he had suggested with contour lines. Perhaps a river was needed. Water inland as well as along the coast, a connection between the two. Yes, a river. He began to draw, starting high on the parchment where the land rose to its highest point. The river would begin there, in the hills, fed by springs or perhaps by rain collected in the high places. It would start as a thin line, barely more than a stream, winding down through the elevation changes he had already marked. The pencil moved across the paper, following the natural logic of water seeking lower ground. The line curved and bent, avoiding the steeper slopes, following the easier path. This was one of the pleasures of drawing rivers. They had their own intelligence, their own inevitable logic. You couldn't place a river anywhere you wished. It had to go where water would actually flow, following the terrain, responding to gravity and geography. The mapmaker drew slowly, paying attention to the way the river would widen as it descended, how it would gather smaller streams into itself, growing from a trickle to a respectable watercourse. He added tributaries, small lines that fed into the main channel, each one suggesting a ravine or valley where water drained from the surrounding hills. As the river approached the coastal plain, he made it wider still, slowing its course, allowing it to meander more broadly across the flatter land. Here it would be deep enough for small boats, perhaps. Deep enough for fish, trout in the upper reaches where the water ran cold and fast, other species lower down where the current slowed and the water warmed. He brought the river to the coast at the protected bay he had drawn earlier. It made sense for a settlement to grow up at such a place, where fresh water met the sea, where boats could come in from ocean fishing and travel upriver to trade with inland farms. But he still didn't draw buildings. The suggestion of human presence was enough. The river mouth, the bay, the worn path he now added running along the river's bank. These things implied civilization without requiring him to depict it directly. The path interested him. He drew it as a dotted line, a cartographic convention for footpaths or minor tracks. It ran upstream along the river's western bank, sometimes close to the water, sometimes veering away where the bank was too steep or marshy. In his mind, he could see this path clearly, packed earth, perhaps overgrown with grass in places, marked by the passage of feet over many seasons. A path worn by farmers bringing goods to the coast, by fishermen heading upstream to fish the river's pools, by travelers moving between the shore and the interior. The mapmaker paused and took a sip of his tea. It had cooled enough to drink, though it was still quite hot. The taste was strong and slightly astringent, cutting through the stillness of the evening with its briskness. He held the cup in both hands for a moment, enjoying its warmth, then set it back on the cork mat. The candle in the glass holder had burned very low now. Its flame was swimming in a pool of melted wax, growing smaller and more uncertain. Soon it would gutter out entirely. The mapmaker opened a drawer and removed a fresh candle, a short, thick one that would fit the glass holder. He waited until the old candle's flame finally died, drowning in its own wax, then used a small metal hook to remove the remaining stub and cleared the melted wax from the holder. The glass was warm to the touch, but not uncomfortably so. He fitted the new candle into place and lit it from one of the others, using a long wooden spill that he kept for this purpose. The flame transferred easily, and soon the new candle was burning steadily, adding its light to the others. For flames again. The study restored to its proper brightness. The mapmaker returned to his map and studied what he had created so far. The coastline, the islands, the hills, the river. These elements formed the backbone of the map, the major features that gave it structure. But a map needed more than structure. It needed life, detail, the small touches that transformed a diagram into a world. He decided to add more vegetation markers. Using the pencil, he drew small, stylized symbols to indicate different types of land cover. Tiny triangular shapes for forested areas, small clusters of dots for scrubland or heath, simple grass marks for open meadows. He worked methodically, moving across the parchment from left to right, filling in the spaces between the major features. A line of trees along the river's upper reaches, growing thick where the valley narrowed. Scattered woodland on the north-facing slopes of the hills, where the sun's warmth reached less directly. Open grassland on the southern slopes and along the coastal plain. These symbols were tiny, requiring careful control of the pencil, but he found the work soothing rather than tedious. Each small mark was a meditation, a small prayer of attention. The act of drawing them cleared his mind of everything except the immediate present, the feel of the pencil, the texture of the paper, the quiet scratch of graphite on parchment. Time passed. The candles burned. The tea cooled in its cup, and slowly, gradually, the map came to life beneath his hands. The mapmaker set down his pencil and flexed his fingers, working out the small cramping that had begun in his hand from the detailed work. He leaned back in his chair and regarded the map with a soft gaze, taking in the whole rather than focusing on any particular element. It was beginning to speak to him now, this landscape, beginning to become a place rather than merely a collection of lines and symbols. He could almost feel the terrain, the way the land would rise and fall beneath one's feet, the way the wind would blow differently on the exposed hilltops than in the sheltered valleys. The way light would change as clouds moved across the sky, casting shadows that raced across the grass and disappeared into the forested areas. These were things that couldn't be shown on a map, not directly. But somehow, if the map was made with care and attention, they became present anyway, implicit in the curves of the contour lines, suggested by the placement of symbols, felt in the overall composition. The study had grown warmer over the past hour. The candles, though small, generated heat as they burned, and the room being small and closed, that warmth accumulated. It was not uncomfortable. Indeed, it added to the sense of shelter and safety that he sought in these evening hours. The world outside might be cooling rapidly as autumn deepened toward winter, but here in this small room, surrounded by his tools and his work, there was warmth and light. He reached for his tea and took another sip. It had cooled considerably now and had taken on that slightly flat quality that tea develops when it sits too long, but he drank it anyway, welcoming the familiar taste. The cup was half empty. He would need to make more soon if he wished to have it through the rest of the evening. But not just yet. First, more work on the map. The mapmaker picked up his pen again, the same fine-pointed nib he had been using earlier, and dipped it into the sepia ink. He would continue inking the features he had drawn in pencil, translating the tentative marks into permanent ones, committing to the decisions he had made. He began with the river, starting at its source in the hills. The pen followed the pencil line, leaving a trail of brown ink that caught the candlelight and seemed almost luminous against the cream-colored parchment. The ink flowed smoothly, the nib responding to his touch, widening slightly when he pressed and narrowing when he lightened the pressure. Drawing the river was like meditation. The line required constant attention, but not tension. He had to be present, aware of where the nib was going, how the ink was flowing, whether the line needed to be thicker or thinner at any given point. But he couldn't force it. The best lines came when he relaxed into the work, when his hand knew what to do without his mind interfering. The river grew as it descended, its line widening, small tributaries joining it from either side. He added these carefully, making sure each one met the main channel at the proper angle, giving each its own character, some flowing boldly, others trickling in as hesitant additions. Where the river reached the coastal plain and began to meander, he slowed his pace even further, savoring each curve. These wide, lazy bends were what happened when water moved through flat land with no urgency, taking its time, carving gentle arcs into the landscape over decades and centuries. He brought the river to its mouth at the bay and added a small delta, just a few lines suggesting where sediment had been deposited over time, building up mudflats and sandbars where the river's current met the tidal waters. This would be a place rich with birds, he thought. Herons standing still in the shallows, watching for fish. Plovers running along the exposed flats when the tide was out. The mapmaker set down his pen and examined the river. It pleased him. It looked like water, like something that moved and changed and sustained life. On a map, this was perhaps the highest praise, when a symbol transcended its conventional meaning and became, in some small way, the thing itself. He dipped the pen again and moved on to the path that ran along the river's bank. This required a different technique, not a solid line but a series of small dashes, evenly spaced, creating a rhythm across the page. Each dash had to be carefully placed, maintaining consistent size and spacing while following the path's route. The work was hypnotic. Dip the pen, make a dash, move forward slightly, make another dash. Again and again, the pattern repeating, the pen scratching softly against the parchment. The path emerged as if it had always been there, as if he were merely revealing something that already existed rather than creating something new. As he worked, his mind drifted again to memories of actual paths he had walked in his life. There had been so many, in so many different landscapes. Mountain paths that climbed steeply through pine forests, the air growing thinner and cooler with each step. Desert paths that stretched straight across vast emptiness, shimmering in heat. Coastal paths that clung to cliffsides, with the sea crashing far below and gulls wheeling overhead. He had walked less in recent years. His legs were not as strong as they once were, his balance less certain. The world had gradually contracted around him until it consisted mostly of this house, this street, the few blocks he could manage on his daily walk to the baker and the greengrocer. But in his maps, he could still travel anywhere, could still create paths that led to places he would never physically reach again. This was not a sad thought, but a comforting one. The maps were not substitutes for actual travel, they were something else entirely. Something perhaps more true, in their way, than physical journeys could ever be. The path reached the coast and ended, or perhaps began, depending on one's perspective. On a map, all journeys were simultaneous. Every route could be traveled in either direction, or not traveled at all, existing only as possibility. The mapmaker set down his pen and picked up his pencil again. There were still elements to be added in pencil before he committed them to ink. He wanted to place some additional details, perhaps some small landmarks that would give the map more character and interest. He considered for a moment, then began to draw a small structure on the promontory that extended into the sea. Just a few quick lines suggesting a building, perhaps a lighthouse or a lookout tower, or simply a cottage where someone might live who loved solitude and the sound of waves. The structure was tiny on the map, hardly more than a rectangle with a suggestion of a roof, but it transformed the promontory from an empty piece of land into a place with purpose, with human connection. Someone had chosen to build there, to make that exposed point their home or their station. The map became, in that small addition, a map not just of landscape, but of human choice and settlement. He added another structure further inland, near the river. A bridge, suggested by two parallel lines crossing the watercourse, with a small notation beside it in his neat, tiny handwriting, "Stone Bridge." Even this small label changed the nature of the map, anchoring it in specificity, giving it history. A stone bridge implied age, permanence, community effort to create a crossing point. The clock chimed again, 9 slow, measured notes. The evening was progressing, though it felt timeless here in the candlelight. Outside, the town would be thoroughly settled now. Shutters closed, curtains drawn, families gathered around hearths or retiring to bed. The streets empty except perhaps for a constable making his rounds, his footsteps echoing off the cobblestones. The mapmaker added a few more small details. A windmill on a hilltop, its presence suggested by a simple cross shape with 4 radiating arms. A small notation reading Mill Hill. A cluster of marks suggesting a grove of trees, with another notation, the Old Grove. Each label was written with great care, the letters formed perfectly despite their tiny size. This had always been one of his skills, the ability to write legibly at any scale, to fit information onto maps without crowding or confusion. It was a skill that required steady hands and good eyesight, both of which he still possessed, though perhaps not as reliably as in younger years. He labeled the bay, Quiet Bay. The name came to him without thought, and he wrote it in a slight arc following the curve of the shoreline. It was the right name. It captured what he wanted the place to be, a refuge, a place of peace. The islands received names as well. He called them simply the Sisters, writing the label in the water between them and the mainland. This implied relationship, connection, a family of land masses that belonged together. The river was labeled at several points along its length. Near its source, he wrote Hiawatha Springs. Where it broadened in the middle reaches, Trout Stream. And at its mouth, where it met the sea, Quietwater Delta. These names were important. They gave character and story to the map, suggested history and human interaction with the landscape. A place became more real when it was named, when language attached itself to geography and gave it meaning beyond mere physical description. The mapmaker sat back and surveyed his work again. The map was taking shape nicely. It had structure and detail, geography and nomenclature. But there was still more to be done, the inking of the smaller features, the addition of decorative elements perhaps, refinements and adjustments. He reached for his teacup and found it empty. The last sip had been taken without his quite noticing. He looked at the cup for a moment, considering whether to make more tea now or wait a while longer. The decision was interrupted by a sound from outside, a cat probably, making some small cry in the darkness. The sound came and went quickly, absorbed by the night. The mapmaker listened for a moment longer, but heard nothing more. He decided to continue working. The tea could wait. He was deep in the map now, immersed in its world, and he didn't want to break the spell by getting up and attending to other matters. The evening was his, the hours were his, and the work would proceed at whatever pace felt right. He picked up his pen, dipped it in the ink, and returned to the parchment. There was something deeply satisfying about this moment. The return to work after a brief pause, the re-engagement with the task at hand. It was like returning to a conversation with an old friend after a comfortable silence. The pen touched paper, and the next line began to flow. The mapmaker began to ink the smaller features he had drawn in pencil. The vegetation symbols, the landmarks, the scattered details that gave texture to the landscape. This was delicate work, requiring a light touch and careful attention. The symbols were small, and it would be easy to make them too heavy, too prominent, overwhelming the map's subtler elements. He started with the tree symbols, the tiny triangular shapes that indicated forested areas. Each one was inked individually, the pen making 3 quick strokes to form a small evergreen silhouette. He worked methodically, moving through the forested areas he had marked, transforming pencil into ink, possibility into permanence. The rhythm of the work was soothing. Dip the pen. 3 strokes. Move to the next symbol. Dip the pen. 3 strokes. The repetition freed his mind to wander while his hand continued its practiced work. He thought about forests he had known. The great pine woods of the north, where the trees grew so thick that the forest floor was carpeted with needles and almost nothing else could grow. The sound of wind in those trees was like the sea, a rushing, breathing sound that filled the air with presence and movement. There had been deciduous forests, too, in the Midlands, oak and beech and birch, their leaves turning gold and red in autumn, the forest floor rich with leaf mold and mushrooms. He remembered walking through such woods on October mornings, the air crisp and clean, the light slanting down through the canopy in shafts of pale gold. These forests existed now on his map, in miniature, in symbol. Each tiny triangle held within it the memory of real trees, real woods, real walks through dappled shade. The map was a compression of experience, a distillation of the world into essential forms. He moved on to the grassland symbols, simple hash marks that suggested open, windswept spaces. These required an even lighter touch than the trees. Too many marks, and the grassland would look cluttered, busy. Too few, and it would simply look empty. The art was in finding the right balance, suggesting texture without defining it too precisely. The pen whispered across the parchment, leaving small marks like a notation of wind or the tracks of small animals. The grasslands emerged, looking open and inviting, places where one could walk freely with the sky above and the ground stretching away in all directions. The mapmaker paused to examine his progress. The vegetation was coming along nicely, giving the map depth and variety. But something else was needed, something to suggest the quality of light, the atmosphere of the place. He decided to add shading. This was a technique he used sparingly, and only on maps meant for contemplation rather than navigation. It involved using the pen to create areas of subtle shadow, suggesting the play of light across terrain, the way some places held darkness while others were touched by brightness. He began with the north-facing slopes of the hills, the areas that would receive less direct sunlight and would remain cooler and dimmer throughout the day. Using the side of the nib, he laid down very light parallel lines, creating a gentle suggestion of shadow. The lines had to be subtle, almost invisible individually, building up to create an overall effect rather than drawing attention to themselves. This was perhaps the most meditative work of all. It required absolute steadiness of hand and consistency of pressure. Any variation would show, any tremor would be visible. But when done well, the shading added a quality of three-dimensionality to the map, lifting it from the page, making the terrain seem to breathe and exist in space rather than merely on a flat surface. The mapmaker worked slowly, adding shading to the hillsides, to the deeper parts of the forests, to the north side of the promontory where it would be sheltered from southern light. The effect was subtle but transformative. The map began to have depth, weight, presence. The candles had burned lower. The one in the pewter holder was more than halfway gone, its flame steady but smaller than it had been. The others were at various stages of consumption, each burning at its own rate depending on the wax composition, the wick thickness, small variations in airflow. The mapmaker paused and looked at the candles for a moment, simply watching the flames. There was something endlessly fascinating about fire, about the way it moved and changed while remaining essentially the same. Each flame was unique in its dance, yet all flames shared the same nature, the same hunger for fuel, the same upward striving, the same gentle light. He had read somewhere long ago, that humans had evolved staring into fires. That our ancestors had spent thousands of generations sitting around flames in the darkness, watching coals glow and sparks rise into the night. Perhaps that was why candle gazing felt so natural, so deeply restful. It was an ancient comfort, coded into the oldest parts of the brain. He returned his attention to the map and continued adding shading, working now on the areas around the river where trees would cast shadows across the water, creating pools of darkness between bright patches where sunlight broke through the canopy. As he worked, he became aware of a slight ache in his lower back. Nothing serious, just the consequence of sitting in one position for an extended period. He shifted slightly in his chair, adjusting his posture, and the ache eased. The cushion compressed differently, finding a new configuration that distributed his weight more comfortably. These small discomforts were part of the work. He had learned long ago not to resist them, but to acknowledge them and adjust as needed. The body had its requirements, its limitations, and there was no point in fighting against them. Better to work with the body, to find positions and rhythms that allowed the work to continue without unnecessary strain. The shading was complete. The mapmaker set down his pen and leaned back to observe the effect. Yes, it was good. The map had gained dimension and atmosphere. It looked like a real place now, a landscape that existed under a particular quality of light at a particular time of day or season. He found himself imagining walking through this landscape on an autumn afternoon, when the light was golden and slanting, when shadows grew long and the air held a touch of coolness that promised evening. He would walk along the river path, perhaps, watching the water flow past, observing the way light reflected off its surface in bright sparkles and dark swirls. Or perhaps he would climb to the top of Mill Hill and stand beside the windmill, looking out over the coastline with the wind in his face, the land spreading below in patterns of field and forest, water and shore. These were impossible walks, of course. The place existed only on parchment. But in imagination, they were as real as any walk he had actually taken. Perhaps more real, because they were distilled to their essence, freed from the inevitable discomforts and disappointments that accompanied physical travel. The mapmaker picked up his pencil again. There were a few more small touches he wanted to add before considering the main work complete. He drew a small notation in one corner of the map, writing carefully in his precise hand. Scale approximate. For peaceful contemplation only. This amused him slightly. It was a kind of joke, though there was truth in it as well. His maps were not meant for actual navigation, not meant to guide anyone to real places. They were maps of the interior landscape, guides to states of mind rather than physical locations. He added the date in the opposite corner, along with his initials. Not a signature exactly, just a small mark of authorship. October 15th, he wrote, followed by EW. The letters were tiny but perfectly formed. The map was essentially complete now. The major work was done. But there remained one more element he wanted to add, something decorative, something that would frame the whole and give it a sense of completeness. He would add a border. This was pure ornamentation, serving no practical purpose, but he enjoyed the ritual of it. A border transformed a map from a mere diagram into a finished piece of work, something complete in itself, bounded and contained. Using a ruler and pencil, he lightly marked the borders where he would draw the decorative frame, a rectangle just inside the edge of the parchment, leaving a margin of blank space all around. Then, using his pen and working very carefully, he began to draw a simple pattern of interlocking lines, a geometric design that repeated around all four sides. The work required intense concentration. The lines had to be perfectly parallel, the spacing perfectly consistent. Any wobble or variation would be immediately visible and would spoil the effect. He worked slowly, measuring by eye, trusting his years of experience to guide his hand. The border grew line by line, corner by corner. It took perhaps 15 minutes to complete, 15 minutes of absolute attention, of hand and eye and mind working in perfect coordination. When it was done, he set down the pen and examined the result. The border was clean and elegant, providing a frame for the map without overwhelming it. It said simply, "This is complete. This is finished. This is a thing made with care." The mapmaker felt a small sense of satisfaction, a quiet pleasure that came not from pride, but from the knowledge of work well done. The map was good. Not perfect, nothing was ever perfect, but good. True to its purpose. Complete in itself. He would let it dry now, let the ink set completely before deciding whether any final touches were needed. Perhaps in the morning, with fresh eyes and daylight, he would see something that wanted adjustment or addition. Or perhaps not. Perhaps it was done. The clock chimed the quarter hour. 15 minutes past 9. The mapmaker stood slowly, stretching his back and legs. The study felt warmer than ever, the candles having done their work over the past hours. The air was still and heavy with the scent of wax and ink and old paper. He walked to the window and looked out into the darkness. The street below was empty, the neighboring houses mostly dark except for a few lit windows here and there. Other people in their evening routines, living their own quiet lives behind walls and curtains. The sky was clear, he could see. Stars were visible between the rooftops, small, distant points of light that had traveled unimaginable distances to reach his eyes. He had mapped stars once, long ago, or attempted to. But the sky was too vast, too deep, too filled with more than any map could hold. He had given up the attempt and returned to earthly landscapes, to scales that the human mind could encompass. A figure walked past below, someone hurrying home late, their footsteps quick and purposeful on the cobblestones. The mapmaker watched until they disappeared around a corner, swallowed by the darkness between street lamps. He turned back to his study and looked at the map on his desk, at the candles burning steadily, at the familiar shelves and tools and objects that filled the space. This was enough. This small room, this quiet work, these evening hours. This was a whole world, complete and sufficient. The mapmaker closed the drawer and turned his attention back to the map on his desk. He found himself drawn to examining the small details he had added, the tiny notations, the labels in their precise lettering, the symbols that suggested vegetation and structure. There was something deeply satisfying about these small elements. They required such care, such steadiness of hand, and yet they were easily overlooked in favor of the larger composition. But they were essential. Without them, a map remained abstract, generalized. With them, it became specific, particular, a place rather than merely an idea of a place. His eye traveled to the notation he had written beside the stone bridge. Stone bridge. Just those two words, but they contained within them a whole history. Someone had built this bridge long ago. Workers had quarried stone and shaped it, had laid foundations in the riverbed, had constructed an arch strong enough to bear weight and endure floods and ice. Generations had crossed this bridge, their footsteps wearing smooth paths across its surface. It had become a landmark, a known point in the landscape, perhaps a meeting place or the site of a market. All of this was implied by those two words and the simple parallel lines that represented the structure on the map. Similarly, the old grove. Those three words suggested trees that had stood for centuries, that had been known and named by people long dead, that had provided shade and shelter, and perhaps a sense of the sacred. A grove could be just trees, but an old grove was something more, a place with memory, with significance beyond its physical presence. The mapmaker took another sip of his tea, savoring its warmth and the slight bitterness that lingered on his tongue. The tea was perfectly steeped now, strong without being harsh, complex in its simple way. He set the cup down and reached for one of his journals, a leather-bound book in which he sometimes made notes about the maps he created. Not technical notes about cartographic methods, but rather thoughts and observations, small reflections on what he was trying to capture or express. He opened the journal to a blank page and dipped his pen in the ink. For a moment he hesitated, uncertain what to write. Then he simply began, letting the words come without planning them. October 15th, evening. Made a map of a coastal region, gentle shores, quiet waters. The kind of place where one might walk without destination, where the sound of waves would be constant but never overwhelming. Added a river that flows from hill springs to the sea. It reminded me of the northern coast, though it is not that place. It is nowhere, and therefore it can be anywhere one needs it to be. He paused, reading what he had written. Then he added, "The work was peaceful tonight. The candles burned steadily. The house was quiet. Outside, autumn deepens. The evenings grow longer and darker, which is not unwelcome. There is something restful about this season's approach toward winter, this gradual letting go of light and warmth. The year is ending as it should, slowly, naturally, without resistance." He set down the pen and read the entry again. It was enough. Not profound, not particularly eloquent, but honest. A small record of an evening's work and thought. The mapmaker closed the journal and returned it to its place on the shelf. These journals accumulated too, like the maps themselves, a parallel archive of words rather than lines, thoughts rather than symbols. He had several volumes now, dating back years, their pages filled with his small, neat handwriting. He rarely reread them. They were not meant for rereading, really, but for the act of writing itself, the process of translating thought into language, of giving form to the otherwise formless flow of consciousness. The writing was a kind of meditation, a way of paying attention to experience rather than letting it simply pass unmarked. The clock chimed the half-hour. 9:30 now. The evening was well advanced, though not yet late. He had hours still before sleep, hours to spend as he wished, working on another map, perhaps, or reading, or simply sitting in the candlelight and allowing his mind to rest in the present moment. He decided he would begin another map. Not a major project, not something as detailed as the coastal map he had just completed, but a small sketch, a simple exercise. Sometimes these quick sketches became the seeds of larger maps later on. Other times they remained as they were, brief notations, visual thoughts that existed for their own sake. The mapmaker took a fresh sheet of parchment from the drawer and laid it on the desk. This one was smaller than the first, perhaps half the size, suitable for a quick study. He picked up his pencil and considered what to draw. His mind was still full of coastlines, of water and shore, but he wanted something different now. Something that would provide contrast to the gentle landscape he had just completed. Mountains, perhaps. High peaks and deep valleys. The kind of landscape that demanded respect, that reminded one of the earth's immense age and power. He touched pencil to paper and began to draw a jagged line across the upper portion of the sheet, a mountain ridgeline, stark and dramatic. No gentle curves here, but sharp angles, sudden rises and falls, the geometry of stone thrust up from the earth's core. The line moved quickly, more instinctively than the careful work on the coastal map. This was different, less controlled, more expressive. He was sketching rather than mapping, allowing his hand to move freely, responding to impulse rather than plan. He added more peaks, creating a range that stretched across the page. Behind the first line of mountains, he suggested others, fainter, receding into distance. The effect was of great depth, of a landscape that extended far beyond what could be captured on a single sheet. In the foreground, he drew a valley, a deep cleft between peaks, its floor hidden in shadow. He added a few quick marks to suggest a river at the valley's bottom, though it was barely visible, just a thread of water far below. The sketch was rough, unfinished, but it had energy. It captured something of the mountain's character, their verticality, their mass, their indifference to human presence. The mapmaker worked quickly, filling in details without overthinking them. A glacier on one peak, suggested by a few curved lines. A cirque, that bowl-shaped hollow carved by ancient ice, high on another mountainside. Scree slopes, indicated by small marks that suggested loose stone. This was the kind of map that could never be walked, not by him, not at his age. These were young person's mountains, requiring strength and endurance, and a certain recklessness that came with youth. But he could draw them, could imagine them, could give them form on paper. After perhaps 20 minutes, he set down his pencil and regarded the sketch. It was complete in its way, though he would not ink it. This would remain a pencil study, soft and suggestive rather than definite and final. He liked the contrast between this sketch and the coastal map. They represented different moods, different landscapes, different ways of being in the world. The coast was about openness, gentleness, the meeting of elements. The mountains were about solidity, endurance, the earth asserting itself against the sky. Both had their place. Both spoke to something true. The mapmaker set the mountain sketch aside and reached for his tea. It had cooled considerably, but was still drinkable. He finished the cup in several long swallows, feeling the liquid settle into his stomach, warming him from within. The candles were burning very low now. The one in the glass holder had perhaps another half-hour of life remaining. The others were in similar states of diminishment, their flames small but steady, consuming the last of the wax in their slow, patient way. Soon he would need to decide whether to light new candles or let the evening draw to its natural close. The map was finished. The sketch was done. The tea was consumed. The natural arc of the evening's work was complete. But he was not yet ready for sleep. There was a quality to this time, these late evening hours, that he was reluctant to surrender. The world outside was fully dark now, fully settled into night. The house was quiet. The study was warm. Everything was as it should be. He decided to light one more candle, just one, and a small one, enough to provide light for another hour or so of quiet sitting, and perhaps reading. He kept a few books in the study, volumes he returned to again and again, reading not for plot or information, but for the quality of the language, the rhythm of the sentences, the way certain passages created a particular atmosphere or state of mind. The mapmaker opened a drawer and removed a fresh candle, a short taper that would burn for perhaps an hour. He lit it from one of the dying candles and placed it in a simple brass holder at the corner of his desk. The new flame added its light to what remained of the others, and the study brightened slightly, pushing back the shadows that had been gradually creeping in from the corners. He reached for one of the books on the shelf, a collection of essays about landscape and memory, written by a naturalist who had spent years walking the remote regions of the country. The book was old, its binding worn, its pages yellowed and soft from repeated handling. He opened it at random, letting it fall open to whatever page it chose. The page that appeared contained a passage about autumn twilight, about the particular quality of light that comes just after sunset when the sky holds on to color even as darkness rises from the earth. The writer described walking through a valley at such a time, watching the light drain slowly from the hills while the first stars appeared overhead. The Mapmaker read slowly, savoring each sentence, letting the words create their own landscape in his mind. This was another form of mapping, he thought. This use of language to capture place and atmosphere, to translate experience into something that could be shared and held and returned to. After a while, he set the book aside and simply sat, listening to the quiet. The house made its small sounds, the settling of timbers, the faint creak of a floorboard somewhere, the almost inaudible tick of the clock. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, and he could hear it moving through the eaves, a soft rushing sound that was more felt than heard. The candles burned on, their flames smaller now, guttering slightly as they approached the end of their fuel. The light in the study grew dimmer, softer, more golden. Shadows lengthened and deepened, claiming more of the room with each passing minute. The Mapmaker sat in the softening light and allowed his mind to drift without direction or purpose. This was one of the gifts of age, he had found. The ability to simply be without needing to do, to exist in quiet contentment without the constant pull of ambition or anxiety that had characterized his younger years. There had been a time when he could not sit still, when every moment had to be filled with productivity or planning, when the future loomed large and demanding. He had worried then about success and failure, about money and reputation, about whether his work was good enough, whether he was good enough. Those concerns had gradually fallen away, eroded by time and experience until what remained was simply this: the work itself done for its own sake, in its own time, without expectation or judgment. He picked up the coastal map again, holding it carefully by its edges, and looked at it in the dimming candlelight. The lines seemed softer now, less distinct, as if the map were beginning to fade back into the realm of imagination from which it had emerged. But he knew this was just an effect of the light. In the morning, in daylight, the lines would be sharp and clear again, the ink permanent and unchanging. Permanence was an interesting quality to contemplate. Nothing was truly permanent, of course. Even stone eventually eroded, even mountains wore down to plains given enough time. But within the scope of a human life, or even several human lives, ink on parchment came close to permanence. These maps might last for centuries if they were kept dry and protected from light and handled carefully. Long after he was gone, these coastlines and rivers and mountains might still exist on their parchments, waiting for eyes that had not yet opened, hands that had not yet been born. The thought was comforting rather than melancholy. The work would outlast the maker, as it should. That was the proper order of things. He set the map down gently and turned his attention to the window. The glass was dark, reflecting the candlelight back into the room, showing him his own faint reflection. An old man sitting at a desk, surrounded by the tools of his trade, caught between light and shadow. He looked old, he thought, studying the reflection dispassionately. When had that happened? The change had been so gradual that he had hardly noticed it, and now here he was, white-haired, face-lined, shoulders slightly stooped. An old man making maps in candlelight. But he didn't feel old, not inside. Or rather, he felt both old and ageless simultaneously. His body was old, certainly. It reminded him of this fact daily with its aches and limitations. But his mind, his capacity for attention and wonder, that remained unchanged. He could still look at a blank piece of parchment and see possibility. Could still lose himself in the work, in the slow translation of imagination into line and form. Perhaps that was what mattered most, not the body's age but the preservation of this capacity for absorption, for care, for the making of things that served no purpose beyond their own existence. The Mapmaker rose from his chair, moving slowly, and crossed to the window. He opened it a few inches, letting cool night air flow into the warm study. The air smelled of autumn, fallen leaves, with smoke from distant chimneys, the faint mineral scent of approaching rain though the sky was clear. The breeze stirred the candle flames, making them dance and waver. Shadows leaped and shifted across the walls. He stood at the window for a moment, breathing the cool air, looking out at the dark shapes of rooftops and chimneys, the scattered lights of windows where other people kept their own vigils against the night. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled, not the hourly chiming but a single, solitary note. Perhaps signaling some event, or perhaps just a test of the bell's mechanism. The sound hung in the air for a long moment, then faded, absorbed by the night. The mapmaker closed the window, leaving just a small gap at the bottom for fresh air. He returned to his desk and settled once more into his chair, which received him with familiar creaking. The candles were very low now. The original four had burned down to stubs, their flames swimming in pools of melted wax. Only the small taper he had lit most recently still had substantial height remaining, though it too was diminishing steadily. He decided he would let the candles burn out naturally. When the last flame died, that would be the signal to end the evening's work, to make his way upstairs to bed, to surrender to sleep and whatever dreams might come. But for now there was still light, still this warm, enclosed space, still the quiet pleasure of sitting surrounded by maps and tools, by the accumulated evidence of years of patient work. The mapmaker reached for his journal again and opened it to the page where he had made his earlier entry. He read what he had written, then picked up his pen to add a few more lines. Made a second sketch tonight, mountains this time, rough and quick. The contrast pleased me. The coast and the mountains, water and stone, yielding and unyielding. Perhaps all landscapes exist between these poles, variations on these fundamental themes. He paused, pen hovering above the page, then continued. The candles are burning down. Soon it will be time to sleep. But these hours have been good ones. Peaceful. Sufficient. I have made my small marks on paper, added my tiny contribution to the vast and ultimately meaningless project of trying to map the world, or perhaps of trying to map one's inner experience of the world, which may be the only world that matters. He stopped writing and read the last sentence again. Was it true? Was inner experience the only world that mattered? Perhaps that was too extreme, too solipsistic. The outer world certainly mattered, the actual coastlines and mountains, the real rivers and shores. But what he had access to, what he could work with, was his experience of these things, his memory and imagination, and the way they combined to create internal landscapes that could then be externalized as maps. It was a circular process, he supposed. The world shaped him, and he in turn shaped representations of the world, which then became part of the world themselves, physical objects that existed in space and could be seen and touched by others. The mapmaker set down his pen. Philosophy at this hour was perhaps unwise. It led to tangles of thought that were hard to unravel, questions that had no answers or too many answers to be useful. Better to return to the simple and concrete. The maps existed. He had made them. That was enough. He closed the journal and returned it to the shelf, then sat back and watched the candles burn. The original four were guttering now, their flames dipping and recovering, dipping and staying low, flickering with increasing urgency as they consumed the last available fuel. One by one, they began to go out. The first was the candle in the pewter holder. Its flame shrank to a tiny point, wavered, and disappeared, leaving only a glowing wick for a moment before that too darkened. A thin tendril of smoke rose from the extinguished wick, carrying the scent of burnt wick and hot wax. Then the one in the glass holder went out, and the one in the brass candlestick beside it. The study grew dimmer with each extinction, the shadows deeper and more encompassing. Only 2 candles remained now, the last of the original 4, and the small taper he had lit later. The mapmaker watched them with the same attention he had given to his work. There was something meditative about watching candles burn down, about witnessing this slow transformation of wax into light and heat, solid matter into flame and smoke and nothingness. The 4th original candle went out. Now there was only the taper, its flame small but steady, burning in its brass holder at the corner of the desk. The study was much darker now, the circle of light smaller, the shadows pressing close. The mapmaker found he liked this gradual diminishment, this slow retreat from light toward darkness. It felt natural, appropriate to the hour and the season. The evening was drawing toward its close as it should, gently, without abruptness, giving him time to adjust, to prepare for the transition from waking to sleeping, from activity to rest. He sat quietly and watched the single remaining flame. It cast a small circle of warm light across the desk, illuminating the map he had made, the tools he had used, his hands resting on the wood. Beyond this circle, The study had become a place of deep shadows and uncertain shapes. The shelves were barely visible now, their contents reduced to dark masses. The window was a lighter rectangle in the wall, reflecting nothing, showing only the darkness outside. The taper burned on, consuming itself with patient steadiness. The flame remained constant in its height and brightness, showing no sign yet of the end that was inevitable and approaching. The mapmaker felt himself beginning to tire. Not exhaustion, but a gentle weariness that was pleasant rather than oppressive. His body was ready for rest, for the horizontal position, for the letting go that sleep required. But he remained sitting, not quite ready to relinquish this moment, this state of quiet watching, this last bit of light in the surrounding darkness. The taper burned lower, inch by inch, moment by moment. The mapmaker sat in the shrinking circle of light and felt the day's work settling into his bones, not as weariness exactly, but as a kind of satisfied heaviness. His hands, which had held pencil and pen for hours, rested motionless on the desk. His breathing had become slow and deep, without his noticing the change. The single candle flame burned steadily, unchanged in its character though diminished in its fuel. It was perhaps an inch tall now. The wax around it melted into a shallow pool that reflected the light back, creating a small golden pool on the brass holder's surface. He found himself thinking about all the candles he had burned over the years in this study. Hundreds, certainly. Perhaps thousands. Each one purchased, brought home, lit, allowed to burn, extinguished or burned down completely. Each one providing its hours of light, making the work possible, creating this bubble of warmth and visibility in the darkness. Candles were simple technology, ancient and unchanging. People had been making light this way for millennia, burning fat, burning wax, burning oil, holding back the darkness with small flames. The mapmaker appreciated this continuity, this connection to the past. When he lit a candle, he was performing the same act that countless humans had performed before him, participating in a ritual as old as civilization itself. The flame flickered slightly, a draft perhaps, or some subtle change in the wax's composition as it burned down toward the holder. The shadow of the pen holder on the desk shifted and steadied, like a living thing breathing. The mapmaker reached out slowly and adjusted the map on his desk, centering it more precisely in the small pool of remaining light. He wanted to look at it once more before the candle died, to see his evening's work complete and present. The coastline traced its gentle path across the parchment. The river wound from highlands to sea. The islands sat in their scattered arrangement offshore. The hills rose and fell in their suggested contours. All of it was there, fixed and permanent, a small world complete in itself. He noticed details he hadn't consciously registered before. A slight thickening in one of the river's curves where his hand had paused, a place where the ink had pooled just slightly, creating a darker spot. This small imperfection pleased him. It was evidence of the hand at work, proof that the map had been made by a human being in real time, with all the small variations and accidents that accompanied any manual craft. Perfect lines could be made by machines, by rulers and compasses and tools that eliminated error. But these slight variations, these small departures from absolute precision, these were what made the work human and alive. The candle burned lower still. Perhaps 20 minutes of life remained, perhaps less. The wax pool had deepened, and the flame seemed to float on its surface, tethered by the wick but otherwise free, dancing its small dance above the liquid. The mapmaker thought about going to bed soon. His bedroom was upstairs, a small room under the eaves with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the back gardens. He would climb the stairs slowly, holding the banister, his legs protesting slightly at the effort. He would prepare for bed in the darkness. He never lit candles upstairs, navigating by memory and the faint light that came through the window from the street lamps outside. The bed would be cool, the sheets smooth and slightly stiff in the way that linen became when it wasn't warmed by a body. He would slip between them and pull the heavy quilt up to his chin, and he would lie there for a while, not sleeping immediately but resting, letting his mind slowly release its grip on the day's thoughts and concerns. And eventually sleep would come. It always did, sooner or later. He would drift into unconsciousness, into dreams or dreamlessness, and the night would pass, and morning would come, and he would wake to light filtering through the window, to birdsong, to another day beginning. But that was still ahead. For now, there was this moment, this last bit of candlelight, this quiet sitting in the study while the world slept around him. He became aware of the clock ticking behind him, a sound so constant that it usually disappeared into the background, but in the deepening quiet it emerged again, marking time in its patient, mechanical way. Tick, tick, tick. Seconds passing, accumulating into minutes, minutes into hours, hours into days and years and lifetimes. The clock had been his father's, or perhaps his grandfather's. He couldn't quite remember now. It had come to him after some relative's death, passed down as such things were, and he had wound it faithfully ever since, maintaining its rhythm, keeping it running through all these years. When he died, the clock would stop eventually, unless someone else took on the task of winding it. Perhaps it would be discovered still ticking when they came to clear out the house, or perhaps it would have already run down, its spring exhausted, its hands frozen at whatever time they had reached when the mechanism finally ceased. These thoughts were not morbid, merely factual. He would die. Everyone did. Objects outlasted people, or sometimes they didn't. The world continued with, or without any particular individual's presence. The acceptance of this fact was another gift of age. When he was young, death had seemed distant and frightening, an ending to be avoided through worry and vigilance. Now it seemed simply like the natural conclusion to a story, the last page of a book. Not desirable exactly, not something to rush toward, but not something to fear either. He had lived. He was living still. And when life ended, that would be acceptable too. The candle flickered more noticeably now. Its flame had begun to elongate, reaching upward as if straining toward some final brightness before extinction. The wax pool had grown shallow, nearly exhausted. The mapmaker watched closely, attentive to these final moments. There was something poignant about an ending, even the ending of something as simple as a candle. It had served its purpose, had given its light freely, and now it was nearly done. The flame grew taller, brighter for a moment, burning with sudden intensity as it consumed the last readily available fuel. The study brightened briefly, shadows retreating, then pressed close again as the flame shrank back down. It wavered once, twice, 3 times. Then it steadied, burning small but pure, a final point of light in the darkness. The mapmaker sat very still, watching, waiting. The flame trembled, dipped low, nearly disappeared. Then rallied, rising again to perhaps half its previous height. It burned there for another minute, 2 minutes, steady and small. And then, without drama or ceremony, it went out. The study plunged into darkness, not absolute darkness, for there was still the faint glow from the street lamp outside, the suggestion of the window's lighter rectangle against the wall. But the working darkness was complete. The circle of candlelight that had made the evening's work possible was gone. The mapmaker sat in the darkness for a long moment, not moving. His eyes began to adjust, finding the room's familiar shapes in the dimness. The desk became visible as a slightly lighter surface. The shelves emerged as vertical shadows. The window showed itself more clearly, a pale square through which the night's faint luminescence entered. He could smell the smoke from the extinguished candle, that particular scent of burnt wick and hot wax cooling. It would dissipate soon, absorbed by the study's air, becoming part of the room's accumulated atmosphere. Slowly, carefully, the mapmaker stood. His legs were stiff from sitting, and he steadied himself with one hand on the desk while blood flow adjusted to the change in position. He stood there for a moment, letting his body settle, letting his night vision strengthen. Then he moved slowly toward the door, navigating by memory and the faint light. His hand found the doorframe, then the door itself. He stepped into the hallway, where it was slightly lighter. The spirit lamp was still burning, its small blue flame providing just enough light to see by. He turned back toward the study for a moment, looking into its darkness. The map lay on the desk, invisible now but still there, waiting for morning light to make it visible again. The mapmaker reached for the door and pulled it closed gently, hearing the latch click softly into place. The evening's work was done. He extinguished the spirit lamp, watching its blue flame shrink and disappear, then stood in the darkness of the hallway, simply breathing, simply being present in the quiet house. After a moment, he turned toward the stairs and began to climb, one hand on the banister, one foot carefully placed after another, ascending slowly into the darkness above. The shore extended before him, soft and welcoming, and the mapmaker continued his slow progress along its edge. He was aware, distantly, that this was a dream, or something like a dream, a state between sleeping and waking where the mind created its own landscapes, its own geographies that followed an internal logic rather than the rules of the waking world. But this awareness didn't diminish the experience. If anything, it enhanced it, allowing him to surrender more completely to the dream's unfolding, to accept whatever came without question or resistance. The sand beneath his feet was perfect, not too soft, not too hard, yielding just enough with each step to feel substantial. Each footprint he left filled with water that seeped up from below, as if the shore were alive, breathing, responding to his presence. He noticed details without focusing on them, the way one does in dreams. A piece of driftwood, smooth and gray, resting above the tide line. A scattering of small shells, each one perfect and complete. The way the waves broke in repeating patterns, each one similar but none exactly the same, an endless variation on a single theme. The light remained golden and sourceless, warming everything it touched. He could feel it on his face and hands, could feel it soaking into his skin like a gentle benediction. There was no shadow here, or perhaps everything was shadow and light simultaneously. The distinction dissolved into something more subtle and complex. Ahead, the promontory was slowly growing closer, though he couldn't have said whether he was moving toward it or it was moving toward him. In dreams, such questions had no meaning. Distance was fluid, negotiable, a matter of attention rather than measurement. As he walked, fragments of memory drifted through his awareness like leaves on water. He remembered being young, remembered a time when his body had moved differently, with ease and unconscious grace. He had walked many shores then, had mapped them with instruments and careful observation, had translated their physical reality into lines on paper. But those maps were different from the ones he made now. Those had been practical, utilitarian, made for navigation and commerce. The maps he made in his study, in Candlelight, were something else, attempts to capture not physical geography but the feeling of place, the essence of landscape distilled into its purest form. Perhaps this shore he walked now was the truest map of all. Not a representation but the thing itself, or something that existed in the space between representation and reality, partaking of both. The thought drifted away as quickly as it had come, replaced by simple walking, simple being. The mapmaker noticed that the shore was beginning to change, though so gradually that he couldn't pinpoint when the change had started. The sand was becoming coarser, mixed now with small pebbles that clicked softly under his feet. The waves sounded different too, less of a soft rush and more of a gentle rattle as water retreated over stone. He accepted this change without question. Shores changed. That was their nature. They were places of constant transformation, shaped by tide and wave and wind, never the same from one moment to the next. Ahead, the promontory was closer now, and he could see that what stood at its tip was indeed a lighthouse, a tall, white structure with a lantern room at its top. But the light was not lit. The lighthouse stood silent and dark against the golden sky, a marker rather than a beacon, a statement of presence rather than warning. He walked toward it, his pace unchanged, steady and unhurried. The pebbled beach gave way to larger stones, smooth and rounded by water, shifting slightly under his weight. He had to step more carefully now, watching where he placed his feet, but this too was pleasant. The increased attention required, the way walking became more deliberate, more mindful. The lighthouse grew larger as he approached, its white walls bright in the sourceless light. He could see details now, the texture of the whitewash, slightly weathered, the dark wood of the door, the narrow windows that spiraled up the tower's exterior. When he reached the base of the lighthouse, he stopped and stood looking up at it. The structure was both immense and intimate, towering above him yet somehow welcoming, as if it had been waiting for his arrival. The door stood slightly ajar. Without hesitation, without thought, he reached out and pushed it open. It swung inward silently, revealing a circular interior, dim after the brightness outside. A spiral staircase wound upward along the wall, each step worn smooth by countless climbs. The mapmaker entered and began to climb. The stairs were steep but not difficult. His legs moved steadily, carrying him upward in a slow spiral. Through the narrow windows, he caught glimpses of the shore below, the water stretching to the horizon, the curved line where sea met sky. Up and up he climbed, around and around, the spiral tightening as he ascended. The interior of the lighthouse was cool and still, holding a quality of silence that felt ancient, permanent. After what might have been many turns, or only a few, time and space were still fluid here, still subject to dream logic. He reached the top. The stairs ended at a small landing, and above that, a ladder led to a trapdoor. He climbed the ladder and pushed open the trapdoor, emerging into the lantern room. The space was circular, enclosed by windows on all sides, empty except for the great lamp at its center, unlit, cold, but somehow still present with potential, with the memory of light it had cast across dark waters on countless nights. The mapmaker moved to one of the windows and looked out. The view was extraordinary. He could see the entire coastline laid out below and around him, The shore he had walked, yes, but also shores that extended in both directions beyond where he had been, curving away into distance. He could see islands offshore, clusters of them scattered across the water. He could see the river mouth he had drawn, the delta spreading its fingers into the bay. He could see hills rising inland, their slopes shaded with forests, their tops touched by light. It was his map, but alive. The map he had made in candlelight, but transformed, given dimension and breath and being. Or perhaps it had always been this way, and the lines on parchment were merely hints, suggestions of this larger reality that existed in the space behind the eyes, in the territory where imagination and memory and longing combined to create places more real than physical geography could ever be. He stood at the window and looked out at this landscape, his landscape, made of lines and ink and attention, but also made of something else, something harder to name. Made of all the places he had known and loved. Made of solitude and quiet work. Made of autumn evenings and candlelight. Made of the slow accumulation of years and the patient practice of craft. Made ultimately of care. The wind moved through the lantern room, though no windows were open. It stirred his nightshirt, touched his face with coolness. He could hear it singing through the lighthouse's structure, a low, sustained note that was both mournful and comforting. Below, the waves continued their eternal work against the shore, shaping and reshaping the boundary between land and water. The light, that sourceless golden light, continued to suffuse everything, making the ordinary extraordinary, turning the world into something both familiar and strange. The mapmaker stood and watched, not thinking, not analyzing, simply present in this moment, in this place that was both dream and something more than dream. Time passed, or perhaps time stood still. It made no difference. He stood in the lighthouse and looked out at the landscape of his making, and felt something he couldn't name. Not happiness exactly, not sadness, but something that contained both and transcended both. A kind of peace, perhaps. A sense of completion that had nothing to do with finishing, and everything to do with acceptance. Acceptance of the work he had done. Acceptance of the life he had lived. Acceptance of the slow progression toward an ending that was inevitable and, when it came, would be acceptable too. He stood and watched as the light began, very slowly, to dim. Not darkening toward night, but softening, becoming more diffuse, as if the world were gradually releasing its hold on clarity and definition. The landscape below grew hazier, less distinct. The sharp lines of coast and river began to blur. The islands became suggestions rather than solid forms. The hills faded into distance and mist. The mapmaker didn't move, didn't resist this dissolving. He watched as the world he had made unmade itself, returning to the realm of possibility from which it had emerged. The light grew softer still and softer, until it was barely light at all, just a gentle glow that held everything in suspension, in a state between being and not being. The glow faded further, becoming less like light and more like a memory of light, a gentle luminescence that seemed to exist more in the mind than in any external space. The mapmaker stood in the lantern room, or perhaps he was no longer standing, perhaps he was floating, or perhaps the distinction between standing and floating had ceased to matter. The lighthouse around him was dissolving too, its walls becoming transparent, then translucent, then simply absent. He was suspended in a soft, formless space that held him gently, without weight, without substance, without boundary. He felt himself drifting, sinking deeper into this gentle void. Not falling. There was no sense of descent, no direction at all, but receding, withdrawing inward, traveling into some interior landscape that existed beyond all maps, beyond all representation. The remnants of the dream shore, the lighthouse, the golden light, all of it was fading now, disappearing like mist in morning sun, leaving only a feeling, a quality, an atmosphere that lingered even as its source vanished. And with that fading came a deepening quiet, a stillness that was complete and perfect. No wind now, no waves, no sound at all except perhaps his own breathing, and even that was so slow, so soft, that it barely registered as sound at all. The mapmaker, though he was hardly aware of being the mapmaker anymore, hardly aware of being anything with a name or identity, continued his gentle descent into this deep, peaceful darkness. It was not frightening, this darkness. It was welcoming, restful, like the darkness of his study after the last candle had gone out, like the darkness of his bedroom where his body lay sleeping, safe and warm beneath the heavy quilt. Images drifted past occasionally, fragmentary and fleeting. A line of ink flowing across parchment. A candle flame wavering in still air. The curve of a coastline. The flow of a river. Small, disconnected moments from the evening's work, from evenings past, from years of quiet labor in candlelit rooms. But these images had lost their distinctness, their separateness. They flowed together like watercolors bleeding into one another, creating patterns that were beautiful precisely because they were undefined, imprecise, open to interpretation or to no interpretation at all. Though even the sense of he was fading now, continued to sink or float or simply exist in this space beyond space, this time beyond time. There was no urgency here, no need to arrive anywhere or accomplish anything. There was only this gentle drifting, this slow dissolution of boundaries between self and not self, between sleeping and waking, between being and not being. The breathing slowed further still, each breath a long, peaceful cycle of intake and release, like waves on a distant shore, like the gentle rhythm of tides marking time in a place where time had no meaning. And with each breath, the sense of separation diminished. The mapmaker, the old man lying in his narrow bed, the craftsman who had spent his evening drawing coastlines and rivers, the solitary figure who lived his quiet life at the edge of the world. All of this was still there, still present, but also increasingly distant, increasingly irrelevant to whatever it was that continued in this deep, still place. What remained was something simpler, more fundamental. A quiet awareness, a gentle presence, the simple fact of being, stripped of all particulars, all specifics, all the accumulated details that made a life unique or identifiable. Just being, just existing, just this slow, peaceful drift through darkness that was not dark, through silence that was not silent, through emptiness that was somehow full. The night deepened around the sleeping house. Outside, the wind continued its work, moving through empty streets, through bare branches, through the spaces between buildings. The street lamps burned steadily, casting their small pools of light onto cobblestones that no one walked. The town slept, each house holding its sleeping occupants, each person lost in their own dreams or dreamless rest. In the small bedroom under the eaves, the old mapmaker's body lay still beneath the quilt, breathing so slowly, so quietly, that someone watching might have wondered if he breathed at all. But he did breathe in and out, marking time in the most fundamental way, participating in the rhythm that all living things share. His face in sleep was peaceful, the lines and creases of age smoothed slightly by the darkness and by the complete relaxation that deep sleep brings. One hand rested on the quilt near his face, fingers slightly curled, the same hand that had held pencils and pens for hours that evening, that had drawn coastlines and labeled bays and created small worlds on paper. Downstairs, in the study, the map lay where he had left it on the desk. In the darkness, it was invisible, its carefully drawn lines and labels and shadings hidden from any eyes that might have seen them. But it was still there, still present, waiting for morning light to make it visible again. The candles that had burned were now just stubs in their holders, pools of hardened wax surrounding exhausted wicks. The tools lay where they had been set down, pencils in their tray, the pen beside the inkwell, the ruler aligned with the edge of the desk. Everything in its place, everything waiting for the next evening's work, or the evening after that, whenever the mapmaker would return and light new candles and begin again. The clock on the shelf ticked steadily onward, marking seconds and minutes that accumulated in the darkness, witnessed by no one, serving no purpose except to maintain the rhythm, to divide the night into measured segments that somehow made it less vast, less overwhelming. The house held all of this, the sleeping man, the waiting study, the dark rooms and closed doors and accumulated years of objects and memories. It held them all gently, as houses do, providing shelter and enclosure, marking a boundary between the private world within and the larger world beyond. And beyond the house, the town continued its own quiet existence. Other people slept in other beds. Other houses held other lives. The river that ran through the town's edge flowed on in darkness, moving always toward the sea that lay somewhere in the distance, beyond the hills, beyond the fields, in that place where land met water and the world opened into vastness. Above it all, the sky stretched infinite and clear, filled with stars that burned in the darkness, each one a distant sun, each one the center of its own system, all of them together creating patterns that humans had long ago organized into constellations, maps of the night sky, attempts to order the chaos, to find meaning and structure in the scattered points of light. The mapmaker, in his deep sleep, knew nothing of this. He was far beyond knowing, far beyond awareness of anything external. He had descended into that place where consciousness dissolved, where the self released its hold on identity and became something simpler, something that existed before language, before thought, before all the complex structures that made up what he called himself. In that place, there was only peace, only rest, only the slow, rhythmic breathing that connected him to all living things, that reminded him, though he was too deep to know this reminder, that he was alive, that he existed, that he was part of the larger pattern of being that included everything. His breathing continued, slow and even, each breath complete in itself, requiring nothing, expecting nothing, simply being what it was. In and out, in and out, like waves on a shore, like wind through trees, like the passage of time marked by clock hands moving in darkness, like candles burning down in empty rooms, like rivers flowing toward the sea. In and out, in and out. The night held him gently, as it held everything, the sleeping town, the dark houses, the quiet streets, the fields and forests beyond, the world in all its vastness, holding it all in its vast, patient darkness, asking nothing, offering everything. And in that darkness, in that deep and perfect quiet, the old mapmaker slept on, his breathing slow and peaceful, his dreams fading into the depths where dreams go when they're done, leaving behind only rest, only peace, only the gentle, endless rhythm of a sleeping body breathing. In and out, in and out. And the night continued, dark and still and infinite, and the world turned slowly on its axis, carrying everything forward through time and space, through darkness toward light, through sleep toward waking, through night toward morning, through the ending of one day toward the beginning of another. But morning was still far away. The night had hours yet to run, and in those hours there was only this, the quiet house, the sleeping man, the dark study with its waiting maps, the candles burned down to nothing, the clock ticking on, marking time that passed but also somehow stood still, that moved forward but also remained always in this single, eternal moment, now and now and now. The mapmaker's breathing grew even slower, even softer, descending into the deepest layer of sleep, that place beyond dreams, beyond thought, beyond everything except the simple continuation of life itself. And there, in that deep and silent place, he rested, completely at peace, completely at rest, breathing gently in the darkness, in and out, in and out. And the night went on, dark and still and infinite, holding everything in its gentle embrace, and the old mapmaker slept, and the maps waited in the darkness, and the candles were gone but their work was done, and all was quiet, all was still, all was exactly as it should be. Rest now. Rest. The night holds you gently. The darkness is warm. The breathing continues, slow and peaceful. In and out. Rest now. Sleep. All is well. All is well. All is well. The story softly ends here, drifting into the quiet of deepest sleep.